South Campus. He received his medical degree from Bangalore Medical College and worked as a psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neuroscience in India. He then completed psychiatric residency training at St. Mary's Hospital in London, which was done in 2007. His personal interests include psychotherapy and complementary medicine. He has completed a course in advanced yogic sciences and practices meditation. And the topic of his talk is Psychotherapy, Perspective of an Evolving Matrix. I very much look forward to hearing what he has to say. Rajesh?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rossi, for the kind introduction. When I initially thought of this topic, it seemed very simple. It seemed like this is something which will have a very clear structure, but I wasn't satisfied. I thought, okay, fine, this is too simple. And I struggled to see how the topic would expand. At some point then, the expansion began. As I recognized more, as I became aware of the vastness of the various topics, various phases of growth that this particular field of psychotherapy has gone through, not just modern psychotherapy, but in various forms over probably our own recorded history of humankind. The difficulty then was reducing what I knew to what I can present. And this is what I felt yesterday. I had a tinge of anxiety, maybe tinges of anxiety. When I conceptualized the theme, the presentation was at infancy. Over 4 weeks, it grew into a form that I hadn't imagined. And I had an afterthought. Is this how God thinks of me? And then I didn't follow this line of inquiry any further, thanks to the unconscious defenses. Something that grows and goes out of control. Now, why exactly, what prompted me to come to this particular theme? 2 years ago, I got the chance really to know more about psychotherapy. Thanks to some very brilliant teaching didactics that we got and the guidance that we have from various faculty, including Dr. Pritchard, Dr. Rossi. Dr. Moreno was particularly very helpful during my outpatient time. I was wondering whether individual patient I will have enough scope to discuss what I'm seeing or what I'm perceiving, what the experience with the patients. And it was all very valuable. There was also, with growing awareness of the field, a kind of a divergence, as if the divergence now needs to meet some form of a convergence, rather than have piecemeal understandings, a piecemeal information of the variety of various different themes, topics, schools of thoughts. Needed to have some kind of a feeling of continuity, as if these things together make sense. Now, working on this theme proceeded along 3 vectors for me. The historical time track until the 20th century, and then the expanse of ideologies and concepts that we have seen in the last century, and the current trends and future. One of the thoughts was, when and how did psychotherapy begin? In what form? And through what reformations has this been through? How has it paralleled the transitions in the awareness of humanity over time? I thought of the changes The changes could be conceived in the external milieu, society, culture, political sphere, economics, and the internal constitution of the individuals in terms of, say, value systems, subscribed beliefs. In a way, I felt levels of awareness. It's a catchy term, particularly with the New Agers. The psychotherapy as a term has come to mean differently over time. Initially, this was borrowed from, the origins of the word is from Greek, psycheia meaning soul, and therapy meaning healing or treatment. Later, towards the 15th century, somewhere, right, it came psycheia, psyche came to be known with mind. And of course, from Jeremy Frank, when he coined the term psychiatry, I don't know whether it came to mean the brain. As an art of guidance or reassurance, perhaps psychotherapy is as old as the origins of human evolution. In the context of recorded history, I present a few points. I tried to sort of examine this in 4 contexts: antiquity, ancient civilization, medieval age, and the modern age. Few points, because I had to really trim it down to make it very selective for this presentation. I will just choose a few points from each of the civilizations, or over the centuries, the transitions and shifts that we saw. There is in Hindu mythology, there's a sacred text, the Gita, and it captures the turbulent period of the Mahabharata war. The warring factions are linked by ancestral lineage. The Pandavas is one faction. They represent the path of principles, and Kauravas represent the values of power, narcissistic interests, control. The embattled factions, they face dilemmas: moral, spiritual, existential. And Krishna, the mythical avatar or the protagonist, provides guidance through a series of expositions on human nature, role disputes, intellectual and emotional conflicts, the dharma, principles of being. He also comes with some revelations about an expanded or unconscious origins of self in an effort to further the self-understanding of the characters. Excuse me. To me, this meant dealing with existential dilemmas. Looking at the ancient Greek civilization, there is a record of pantheon of gods, goddesses, each with his or her own genealogy, expertise, governed by unique personalities and having specific functions. There is a mention of the age of gods, where gods live with humans. And then there is a transitory periods where gods and mortals live together. This is followed by the heroic age of demigods, where divine rulers gain succession and gods are mentioned to be no longer born. The Egyptian civilization also had similar beliefs about divine and afterlife. Seems like gods there had supernatural powers. They could be called for help or through various practices or appeased. There was a mention about human beings composed of being physical and spiritual parts. People having a body, a shadow, a personality, using the term ba, and a life force. The term used is ka for that. Roman civilization again had similar paradigms of genesis of the world, succession of divine rulers, worship of gods and goddesses. looking at the civilizations across and reading more about it, what I felt is that there were conceptions of divinity and are not seen contradictory, but rather layers in the multiple facets of reality. As a narrative, I saw it in two terms, a kind of a process there and shifts. It seemed like life was a coexistence, if at all, at the physical dimension and the spiritual dimensions, which later, through the time track, changes into the coexistence of the mortal human beings with spiritual entities having supernatural powers. Was there a constriction in the awareness of, as I say, multidimensional living? Or perhaps a shift in paradigm from experiencing self as a natural state to an identification later of self as a relatively mortal personality. And something, the experience becoming peripheral and being experienced through the mind and intellect. Nevertheless, by the period of recorded history, when it began, a philosophical culture about life had become prevalent. There was a mix of religious, magical, or medical perspectives being the approaches to address disease. And this shift was the start of the classical Greek philosophy. This was about 500 BC, maybe, where the Buddhist philosophy had taken roots. And they considered the origin of mental suffering as being ignorance, attachments, craving for mind or sensual experiences. They propounded the Eightfold Path, which suggested that we maintain virtues and avoid vices through a series of observations. The Four Noble Truths were the cornerstones. It also, the Four Noble Truths mentions suffering is ingrained part of existence and originates from sensuality, acquisition of identity, and fear of annihilation. We see these concepts mentioned even in the modern psychotherapy in various schools. The Chinese system, when around 400 BC, spoke about balancing the energies yin and yang and the life force qi. There was also some texts mentioning the link between organ systems and emotions. The Vedic psychology similarly came up with the Ayurveda, the philosophy, and the principle of three basic elements, equivalent to Hippocrates speaking about the four humors and the balance between these four humors as being the key to human health. Towards the later part, there's a shift again where Plato says brain is the mechanism of mental processes. Aristotle mentions, or it's mentioned that Aristotle believed that heart is the seat of mental processes. Towards the end of the Athenian classic philosophical age, there seems to be a diffusion. A diffusion in the sense that there were a rapid turnover of various opinions, counter-opinions, and some of these are mentioned in over the about 100 years. We see Peripatetism, skepticism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, each with their own philosophy about life. But it seems again that there was a move towards practical living, going for desires, achieving what you want, and that's what Stoicism was about: character, nobility, virtues, being more important than any kind of moral basis. And all this led towards the Hellenistic age, where there was a diffusion, almost seems like a splintering, where there was no dominant or one prominent philosophy. Things were drawn from various different schools, various different approaches. And at the end of the Hellenistic age, it seems like there is a re-assimilation, or there is an assimilation, where in certain parts of the world, particularly after the Alexandrian Empire is gone, and the Persian Empire is also at the end, a lot of religions get tied into the existing philosophical ideas. There is Avicenna, a lot of people from the Islamic world translate the scripts or the texts from the Greek world, and they adopt it locally to the cultural beliefs. The medieval age further saw further expanse of religion. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism was there, but in Judaism in a reformed manner. And gradually it seems like through this phase, religion became the main force which provided, through faith healing and various other measures, forms of relief or guidance or therapy. And this was an interesting observation. When I was in India about 15 years ago, we rarely had patients coming to us directly. Psychiatric patients first went through various religious rituals of cleaning, possession, things that was most of the psychiatric problems were out of effect of curse or effect of possessions. And they would go through elaborate rituals. Sometimes it would be 4 or 5 years before they would present. More so, this was clearly in the rural areas. We could still see that. Now, modern philosophy took root around the 16th century with René Descartes. He is the father of modern philosophy, and he spoke about self as the main thing and self-consciousness as the primary fact of existence. He laid emphasis on the values of introspection, deductive knowledge, and that mind and body existed as two entities with a bidirectional influence. This period was also saw the rise in Europe of continental rationalism, or the age of reason. There were a sequence of philosophers there, each propounding a lot of different ideologies and a lot of work. But towards and Kantian philosophy inspired a lot of the modern philosophers too. Towards the end of the 18th century, there was a shift again. And this was by David Hume and many others who were like-minded, said that desire rather than reason governed behavior. Then this age is called the age of Romanticism, the late 19th century. Towards the late 19th century, we also saw hypnosis being explored further, and the idea of the unconscious. There were still a lot of the exorcism, and in terms of exorcism, possessions, even in continental Europe, witchcraft, we had all these things. And it again seems to be a phase where there was no clear dominant philosophical concept or ideology guiding people. Religion perhaps was being questioned a lot, and Freud himself initially tried hypnosis, and after various abreaction and catharsis, and then he laid the foundations of what came to become the scientific focus with attempts to understand what it means to be human. What we see during this phase is also an explosion of thinkers with backgrounds in philosophy coming out with various different schools of thought, exploring different aspects of human mind and human living. An existential crisis during those phases might have contributed to this orientation and this explosion in the number of people wanting to find solutions to human predicaments. Sigmund Freud, when he came up with the psychoanalytic thought, evolved to focus on his thoughts evolved more with a focus on the physical rather than the metaphysical. But at the same time, there were other thinkers like Jung, Otto Rank, who was more of an existentialist. So there was a variety of approaches which gave rise to different schools of thoughts. Now, for this presentation, I thought this was too much for the time to explore them individually. And so what I did is decided to kind of compile and get an idea of what do we have in this last century. The expanse of concepts include the idea of the preconscious, the conscious, the unconscious, the structural theory that we had about the mind, the defense mechanisms which became the cornerstone of many psychological approaches and are still relevant across schools of thought, the concept of drives leading to conflicts, the efforts to adaptation, compromise formation, gaining insight as an important therapeutic aim to get over the problems. The other concepts include anima, animus, shadow, archetypes, about consciousness, the collective consciousness by Jung. And much of Jung's initial work was further expanded by the later workers in the field. We also know more about the structural composites, that is, about traits, temperament, personality, character, and what makes these things. Also, we know that there is a differentiation between an exteriority or an external realm and the internal realm. The concept of self, it seems like there were various contributors initially, but Heinz Kohut's work, Winnicott's concept of true self, false self, these led to separate areas of further expositions and investigation. The further developmental work about the origins of self through a series of identifications, through internal object representations, leading to a sense of self-identity or cohesive self-identity, and the fruits of it in the way of self-esteem, self-needs, being able better to meet. I mean, this has led to a whole big school of not just a theoretical orientation work as well. Deficits leading to autistic self, fragmented self, and various other problems. The concept of ego as a chief mediator of our intrapsychic world, has led to the school of ego psychology. It influences the conscious and the unconscious, the conscious aspects like cognition and many other, and the unconscious, mainly the defense mechanisms. We have a greater understanding through a series of workers who contributed, including Anna Freud and others. Management of ego helps in the management of anxiety and conflicts, mediates the experience of ourselves as self and the object. We have this particular concept of observing ego, and the experiencing ego was very difficult to digest initially, but then finally I think this has been an important area of awareness. Through my work today, I think gradually that was one important thing to be in a therapeutic situation and have awareness of both the dimensions. Reality testing and orientation to reality is mediated by a healthy ego. In the field of cognitive development through the middle of the last century, we had a greater understanding of the theory of mind, mentalization theories, which finally has come together to form a mentalization-based treatment model for the borderline personality disorders. Piaget's stages of cognitive development further was very helpful in understanding the various stages, and surprisingly, initially, though it was difficult to believe, many of them I could see through observing my own child growing up. Melanie Klein and many other workers, Margaret Mahler, all their works contributed to a further expansion of our understanding in the developmental field. Attachment. It means an open, intimate, emotionally meaningful relationship, according to John Bowlby. Now, the attachment is almost like a conduit which helps in the development of the internal identity in the world. Knowledge of the psychophysiological states is gained through these initial phases of attachment, and particularly through the proximity with the nurturer. This has led to a further expanse, and attachment theory-based treatment models are followed by a lot of the therapists. Further understanding was in the area of self-object relation, where early internalized relationships function as the building blocks. Internalized representations, initially as part objects, lead to integration later into a whole self-representation, contributing to the self-identity. Failure of this integration creates issues, many problems with identities, with self, and as well as the relationship with the outside world. Interpersonal theories and intersubjectivity theories somehow are mentioned as the kind of third force. The first force was obviously psychoanalysis and the psychodynamics. The behavioral psychology, the cognitive behavior therapies, they were all like the second force. And then we have the third force of psychology. It's also mentioned somewhere that these theories contribute what is called the post-structuralist or post-modern approaches of theoretical orientation. For me, it felt like these theories were kind of offshoots from what we had learned earlier. The area of cognition. Cognoscere is a Latin term. It meant knowing and information processing. We know much more about mental processes and internal states, problem solving, schemas, development of self-concepts. Schema-focused therapy is practiced and propounded by a lot of people. The area of automatic thoughts, biases, attributions, it's a conscious process based in current context. And thankfully, most of my own experience was with CBT, and it was really good. It was easy for me. I felt that I could comprehend, and I saw results there, which made me feel good, and somehow lent me the confidence that I could be in psychotherapy. But I also realized with time that this wasn't enough. The behavioral approaches through learning models early on has further developed in 1920s and then again gained ground in the 1950s and 60s through the contributions of people like Skinner, Joseph Wolf, and has become its own, come of its own. Functional analysis and various other schools that has been refined, and it applies a lot of the behavioral techniques in modeling, coaching, mainly in a lot of field apart from mainstream psychiatry. But even here, problems like habit reversal from problem behaviors can be effectively addressed through the behavioral approaches. The existential philosophy, I see that on and off. It seems like there is a phase in human life where not just at an individual level, but as a nation or as humanity itself, we have phases where we have crises. And logotherapy was one thing which propounded by Viktor Frankl, and it was the search for meaning. That meaning can guide you through dilemmas. So it also culminated in other thinkers coming in with their thoughts, and they emphasized the discovery of free will, freedom of choice, responsibility, courage, and that life can be perceived in 4 dimensions of human existence: physical, social, psychological, and spiritual. Somehow this further takes off into a humanistic, when humanistic models started gaining ground. These were rooted in existential thought. They had a non-pathologizing view. It was based on actual lived experience, and aspects of self-actualization, hope, love, contact with nature was propounded. This also was on the background of a lot of work by similar thinkers like Abraham Maslow, William James, who came together, Viktor Frankl himself. And the same contributors later also helped develop the transpersonal psychology. This holds a self-transcendent view and incorporates spirituality with psychology. Seems like many of these thinkers worked on what initially Carl Jung had propounded, and contributions from Stanislav Grof and a few other names that which I have omitted here. System-based therapies took root, and again these are the postmodern schools, but they it examines the individual and helps the individual adapt in a group, where a family or in couples, particularly group dynamics, and even culturalist philosophies contribute to this school of thought. The real postmodern concepts, the latest ones, what I read, is about narrative therapy and solution-focused therapy. And one interesting concept here mentioned was externalizing the problem. And how do we do that? So it seems like the focus of the therapist is to encourage the patient to talk about the problem and then view the individual as separate from the problem itself. Now this helps the person to then look at the problem without feeling deficient himself. I don't have an experience on this personally, but this has been, what I hear is that this has been practiced by a lot. Actually, I saw a YouTube video on how it is done. I don't have any personal experience on that to comment any further. Mindfulness, this has been around. I thought this might just be the last 10 years, but as I try to search more, in the last 25 years, I think, or maybe more, this has been a key concept being integrated with a lot of the psychotherapeutic approaches. Of course, there was this concept of eclectic approaches to psychotherapy. There is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Just backtracking, I forgot to mention about CBT there. So CBT became much scientifically explored and a very effective form of therapy with a combination of cognitive and the behavioral approaches. And perhaps it works very well in many number of disorders and problems. But I also kind of looked at the mindfulness training and how it originated, the DBT and various other schools that are that have their origins, or they take some knowledge from there, from those concepts, from the Buddhists. They come from the Buddhist philosophy. There is also some that is taken from the Zen meditation and the Japanese. And I wondered again, where are we going with the psychotherapy? Again, are we coming from a very reductionistic models of the mind, are we again trying to go through an expansive models which help in a process of expansion? And finally, this is what I try to make sense of it and see how can I summarize what I had read through, particularly for the purpose of this presentation. And this is what I see, that from over a period of time, it seems like things gain prominence, different schools of thought, different ideologies gain prominence. There is a cycling. There are patterns where the same thing goes into a phase of diffusion and kind of splintering, and it's rediscovered at some later point of time and adapted again to suit the needs of that time, the culture, the context. So looking at this history, I felt there is a dimensional view and then the plane view. So if we look at being and personality and the core as the planes, and the dimensions being a divine vantage point, or from a philosophical, from a romantic, or the physical, or the biological. Where are we today? Are we today at a phase where we are focused more on biology and physical to the exclusion of others? Or is it that the older systems were merely expansive concepts? There is also, I mean, these arrows here, I kind of put it, I felt like, are there two forces operational in life? One is an expansive force all the time, wanting us to go beyond the concepts that we are most in tune with today, what we identify with today. And the other is a reductionist model to try and make things to a bare minimum, or oversimplifying things. And finally, I'm left with some questions. Where are we headed, finally? We also see a changing socio-cultural context. We see the economic pressures. What are the areas that could further need understanding? What do we know and what do we need to know further? And is it possible through future research? And research in psychotherapy has not been only controversial, has been difficult by the very nature of it. But still, there has been some very good work. But I wouldn't know much more to say. I try to look at it. I think there are better people, more experienced people here who could guide us in that way. That's where I stop.